This is lesson 1.2 continued, and we're talking about non-arguments, passages that are not arguments. So a conditional statement was an example of one statement that's not an argument because an argument has to have two statements. Now let's talk about cases where we have multiple statements and they may be related, but there's no argument. And the defining feature here is that there's no attempt to prove or convince. So the next type of non-argument that I want to talk about is what we call an explanation. An explanation can be a very tricky thing. An explanation can look a lot like an argument. And an explanation often uses the same language, the same type of language that arguments use. In fact, when I tell you how I want to define explanation, I bet you're going to think that sounds just like what he said an argument was, but I'll try and make the difference clear. We said that an argument happens when someone offers a reason to believe that something is true. Now, an explanation doesn't do that, but an explanation offers you a reason why something is true. Now, I bet you're thinking, that sounds the same thing, but there's a difference. Offering a reason why, I can offer you a reason why something's true and not be offering you a reason to believe it. So let me give you an example. Suppose we're standing around in a chemistry lab having a discussion after school, and suddenly a beaker on the countertop explodes and shatters, and the pieces fall on the ground. And you're shocked and you say, oh my God, what happened? And now I say to you, that beaker exploded because it contained liquid nitrogen. Notice that the language that I'm using here has something in common with the language of arguments. I'm using the word because, which we said can indicate a premise. But I never said that the word because, every time you see that word, it's going to be a premise and you're going to have an argument. I didn't say that. Sometimes the word because, instead of introducing a premise of an argument, it introduces an explanation. So here's the difference. We have the statement that the beaker exploded, and we have the statement that it contained liquid nitrogen. But I'm not trying to convince you that the beaker exploded by telling you it contained liquid nitrogen. You already believe that the beaker exploded. I mean, we're standing here looking at the shattered pieces of the beaker all over the floor, and you and I both know that it exploded. You even asked, why did it explode? So when I say it contained liquid nitrogen, and that's why it exploded, I'm not offering a proof that it did explode. Instead, I'm offering the reason why it exploded without trying to convince you that it exploded. So we can think of an explanation as having parts that are analogous to the parts of an argument. An argument has its conclusion, and it has a premise that's offered as a reason to believe the conclusion. And with an explanation, we have some statement that's accepted by the parties to the conversation. And the explanation is offered not as a reason for anyone to accept the statement, because it's already accepted, but as explaining the reason why it's true. Now, we're going to have to worry about a couple of complications with this. But first, let me mention that you should pay attention to the way we're using the word explanation here in a special way. Outside of logic class, you may hear the word explanation used or the word explain used in a very generic kind of way. So people sometimes say things like, let me explain, or I explain, and then they just say some stuff. Like you might go into a store, try to return something. Say you've got to return a video game. And the person at the store says, let me explain our return policy for you. Our return policy is that we don't do returns. Now, that seems like a normal use of the word explain in everyday use outside of logic class. But when we talk about explaining in logic class, that's not explaining. He just told me that's the policy. An explanation in the logic class sense has to give me the reason why something's true. So be careful that you're not thinking of explain and explanation in that generic outside of logic class way. A passage that says a number of things but doesn't tell you the reason why something's true, that's not an explanation. Now, I said there were going to be some complications, so let's get into that. An explanation consists of a statement or statements that are offered as the reason why something is true. And in the example that I gave you, I just tell you that the reason why the beaker exploded is that it contained liquid nitrogen. I simply state that that is true and that that is the reason why it exploded. But what can confuse matters here is that once I offer an explanation, we can do some reasoning about whether that's the correct explanation or not. And then arguments come into it because I'm going to give you an argument that that is the correct explanation. Or maybe you're going to give me an argument that that's not the correct explanation. So let's take an explanation that's got a little more substance to it, maybe an explanation that would be maybe more controversial. Suppose we're talking about the fact that it rains, and you and I know that it rains. Everybody knows it rains. Suppose we address the question, why does it rain? And I offer you an explanation. I say, the reason why it rains is that sometimes the gods, Zeus and Hera and Apollo, they have a big party. And the gods, they drink wine, and there's a bunch of them up there getting drunk, and they have to relieve themselves as the night goes on, or as their time goes on. And so that comes down on us in the form of rain. Rain is the gods peeing on us. So the accepted statement is that it rains, and then my explanation is that the gods are peeing on us. Now I might then give you an argument that this is the correct explanation. As it stands now, I have given you no argument. I have given you an explanation, but I've not argued that it's the correct explanation. I've just told you that it is. But if I say, we know the gods like wine because everybody likes wine. Who doesn't like wine? And we know that they're up there partying because we hear noise coming from up there. There's a rumbling in the sky because the gods are up there dancing around. And so, of course, they're having a party, and that means they're drinking wine. So, of course, that must be why we experience rain. Now I've given you an explanation, plus I've given you an argument as to why you should believe that explanation. So these two things, argument and explanation, can be mixed up together. But when an explanation occurs and a person simply states, this is the reason, that is not an argument. That's just an explanation. Now there's one more complication here, and that is that whether something's an argument or whether it's an explanation has to do with the person's motivations who's saying the things that they're saying. Are they offering you a reason to believe, or are they just offering you a reason why? And that means that the same language, the same string of words could be an argument or it could be an explanation depending on the context. Let me give you an example. Suppose that one day I come home and I check my mailbox and I don't see any mail in the mailbox. Then I go inside, and let's say I have a roommate, and I say to my roommate, there's no mail today. That's funny. And then my roommate says to me, there's no mail today because it's Sunday. Now take a second to consider, would that be an argument or would that be an explanation? It's an explanation. That is, I already believe that there's no mail. I just said there's no mail. I checked. I don't know why there's no mail. And my roommate is reminding me that today's Sunday so that I'll understand, that's why there's no mail. Now let me tell you a different story, and it's going to lead up to the same sentence. Suppose I wake up in the morning, and I get dressed, and I haven't been outside yet. And I have a roommate, and I say to my roommate, I'm going to go and check the mail because I'm expecting some money. And then my roommate says, wait, don't even bother going outside. There's no mail today because today is Sunday. It's the exact same string of words. But in this case, is it an explanation again, or is it an argument? It's an argument. We can tell that my roommate is trying to convince me that there's no mail, offering me a reason to believe what I don't already believe, that there's no mail today, by reminding me that it's Sunday. So the motivation in this case is different. So there's something that can be pretty tricky about explanations. The same sentence, the same string of words, could be an explanation in one context, and it could be an argument in another context. Now, obviously, I can't give you a test and put, there's no mail today because it's Sunday. Is that an explanation or is that an argument? If I was going to give you a question like that, I would have to give you a background story leading up to the sentence so that you'd have some context to say whether it's an explanation or whether it's an argument. And the overall theme here is that an explanation is one of the most difficult things to distinguish from an argument. So we always need to be careful about whether we're being presented with an argument or whether we're just being presented with an explanation of something, or whether we're getting an explanation plus an argument that it's the correct explanation.